Hello, welcome back to Cognitive Psychology. We are now moving on to the chapter on language. You may notice this is a longer set here, so I will try to keep these videos as brief as I can, but I do want to make sure that we get through all of the relevant content here on this chapter. And language is a very kind of broad, overarching subject that covers things related to the way in which we understand meaning, word meaning, the way we communicate with others, a little bit of social psychology, um, as well as a lot of just like the basic cognitive psychology of how we are even able to process the sounds of language and also produce the sounds of language. So we can come at this from a lot of different perspectives here. And I kind of have this even just in the title slide, right? We can use words like language, but we can use linguistics or psycholinguistics, right? That's the psychological aspects of language, as well as how we perceive speech and words. So let's get into it first by defining language. I have here four characteristics of language, four I guess you could call them definitions, right? We would say that in order for something to be considered language, it needs to have at least these four characteristics. And so, what's useful and important here is that when we ask questions like, do animals use language? One of the things that we may find, and sometimes we might even be tempted to disagree with, is most people answer, most scientists will answer at least, that animals do not have language. And sometimes this might be confusing because we might think, oh, maybe you know, animals communicate with each other and they understand, maybe my pets understand when I attempt to communicate with them. So they seem to have some kind of linguistic understanding, right? But what we can maybe better understand here is that when we look at these four characteristics, what we're really suggesting is that what animals are doing doesn't rise to the level of meeting all four of these properties. They might understand communication. So that's one of our four choices here. They might even also understand semantics. That is, that there's the idea of meaning, and symbols can have meaning, but maybe they don't have the generativity or the grammar, and that's kind of critical here. But let's talk about what these all mean, and we'll start with this idea of semantics, right? So symbols have meanings. So what am I saying here, right? A symbol can mean anything, right? A symbol can be an image, it can be a picture. Um, and so in that sense, we could say that the semantic content of this drawing that I made, for example, I could just draw a picture of a house, right? And I could say that it has semantic meaning, right? It has content. It represents a house, and so that term of representation is pretty critical for semantics here, right? That's what symbols really are, is they are representations. When it comes to language, we're specifically talking as well, if at least with regard to spoken language, we are talking about the sounds as symbols, right? So if I say the word house, then that means that becomes a sound that is a symbol that means house, right? And these are, of course, will be somewhat arbitrary and vary from, well, the arbitrariness is kind of important here, right? There's nothing about the sound that I'm making, house, right, that is in any way meaningfully connected to the actual thing that is a house, right? It's just an artifact of the English language that that particular sound has that meaning. If I'm in another language and I say casa, la casa in Spanish, then it's the same semantic content, but it's clearly a different sound entirely, right? So that would suggest that what we have here is a form of representation that is somewhat arbitrary. Another characteristic of semantics here is the concept of displacement, that I can use the word house and think about houses even when I am not, in fact, looking at one, right? And so this represents a particular quality of human cognition that relates to this issue of symbolism, right? Symbolic thinking. is a kind of thinking that involves mental representations, that I can mentally represent a house even when I'm not looking at one. And that means that I can mentally represent my own house even when I'm not at home and looking at it. I can also imagine, of course, novelty here, right? And I can imagine a house that I have that doesn't even exist. But this, of course, this gives me the ability to, maybe if I wanted to be an architect, I could design my fantasy house here by symbolically thinking about all of the things that I want it to have, right? So this is a characteristic of language. And what's critical here is that not only could I maybe, symbolize and represent my fantasy house, but if I'm not an architect, I could describe to an architect in words what I want from that. And that's the communicative part here. This is kind of what we also have in this image on the right here. This idea is that, well, there's a tree as the example instead of a house, but the idea is that what language really involves is transferring thoughts from one person to another person. And it's kind of weird when you think of it that way, right? But that's what happens, is that I have an idea in my mind and I want you to have this idea in your mind. So how do I put this idea into your mind? Well, what I have to do is I have to find a way to turn my idea into a set of words, into a set of sounds. This is called the codifying process, right? I am encoding the idea into symbols that convey meaning, that hopefully will convey meaning about the ideas that I'm trying to get across. I then transmit those symbols to you by speaking, right? And that's the sending the message, step two. And then you get the symbols, and what you have to do is you have to decode that so that you can then understand and hopefully have the idea in your mind that was the intended message, right? So there's a lot of kind of like this stuff that's kind of hidden and implicit in this whole idea of communicating, which is that I have ideas. I encode them into some kind of symbols. It could be the sounds. It could be written, right? So I'm going to write a message that's different, and now I still have to come up with the words, but the way in which it gets encoded is going to be a little bit different now. Then the message has to be transmitted, the message has to be received, and then the message has to be decoded. So that way you generate the same ideas. And so that means your interpretation of what I say is going to determine whether or not the message is communicated correctly, right? So if I'm trying to tell you about some weird tree that I saw, whether or not you're going to really understand that is dependent on my effectiveness in encoding that message, as well as your ability to decode what I have said appropriately. Going back to my example about my fantasy house, right? Let's say that I do hire an architect. One of the things that's pretty critical here is that I need to describe what I want my fantasy house to look like and what I want, what the features are and everything very effectively so that the architect understands what it is that I want and they get an idea in their head so that they can then start working on their drawings and design it appropriately. And of course, this also becomes discourse, because what will typically happen in a situation like that is that they will draft up something and then they come back and say, is this what you wanted? And then I provide feedback, and then we go back and forth a little bit until everything starts to take shape, right? But that all involves this kind of transmission of ideas between people, and that involves, of course, this semantic, symbolic kind of thing here. What's also a key component of language here is this issue of generativity, or sometimes we'll call it productivity. But what we're saying here is that we've got, I don't know how many words. I didn't bother to look that up, but how many words are there in the English language? Many thousands at least, right? So that means that there are many combinations that can be generated. Now, what's important here is that there are some combinations of words that are not allowed. And we're going to maybe put a hold on that for a second. But down at the bottom of the slide, there's a note about the grammatical side of language. And that's, at least in part, a component of grammar, is to set certain rules for how words can go together in a sequence to make a statement, a sentence of some sort, right? So some word combinations are not allowed, but even when we stick within the rules of grammar, there are still nearly an infinite number of combinations of these words, right? What I mean by this is that what's really critical here is that it is, in fact, possible for me or you or anyone else to say something that has never been said before by another human being in the history of humans and language, right? So, how does that occur? Well, it simply can occur by saying something, by saying anything, right? I could say, uh, I could describe something very mundane, such as the card is on the desk. I'm just looking at a card laying on my desk over here, right? Now, there's a good chance that someone has said that before. But if I were to say the green, purple, and red card is on my desk, then maybe that's never been said before, right? And so these kinds of, all we have to do is throw in a few descriptors and a few extra things, and then suddenly I've said something that's totally novel. But what's part of this, what makes this really important is that despite the fact that I can say something that's completely novel, and whether it's been said before by another human is maybe less relevant than whether or not you've ever heard this sequence of words before, right? So I can tell you something, and I can use words that in a sequence that you have never heard before, but you can still understand it. In fact, most of what I am saying in the last 5 minutes is probably a long series of words that have never ever been spoken before, and you have never heard that sequence of words before, but hopefully you're learning something about language right now, which relates again back to our semantic content, that my ideas are turning into ideas in your mind at this point, right? This relates to then this distinction between surface structure and deep structure, right? The deep structure represents the actual content, the ideas that I'm trying to get across. The surface structure represents the codifying process. What are the choices that I make when it comes to what words do I want to use and how do I want to get this message across, right? So that's the surface structure. But the deeper message, that's the deep structure. And so there's a difference between them, right? So what influences that? What determines my choices for surface structure, right? I know the idea that I have, but I have to make certain choices for the surface structure. Well, that's what the next 2 points have in common here, right? The communicative social pragmatics, that influences my surface structure, but so do the rules of grammar, right? So the rules of grammar, it's just kind of built in, implicit, because I know how to speak in English, that I'm going to follow things like the syntactic rules, right? The syntactic rules specify the word order, right? So something as simple as subject, verb, object as a kind of as a construction for a sentence, that's a syntactic rule. The fact that uh, adjectives come before nouns, at least in English, that's a syntactic rule. If in Spanish, we're going to flip that around and we're going to say that the adjective comes after the noun. But nevertheless, those are the kinds of constraints that influence my surface structure. But before I get into the details of grammar, I want to talk more about the social pragmatics here, right? And that is actually explored a little bit on the next slide. Whoops, jumped around there. So let's explore these a little bit here. So here's something to talk about with social pragmatics. We're going to get to this maybe in other chapters on social cognition, but let's cover this here. Theory of mind. What in the world is theory of mind? If you've heard of this, if you've had maybe a developmental psych course or maybe a social psychology course, you've probably encountered this before. But if this is new to you, it might be kind of a confusing term, right? At face value, you think theory of mind would be some theory about what minds are. Uh, and yeah, not quite, kind of, but not quite, right? So what we mean here is that when we say theory of mind, what we're really talking about here, I think, is better termed schema of mind. That's my preference. Because what we're suggesting is that over the course of our lives, we develop schemas, right? Knowledge structures about how we understand things that are part of our lives, right? So if I have a schema about psychology, that essentially means everything that I know about psychology is part of that schema. Uh, so the idea is that I also have a schema about minds, right? That is, that over the course of typically in childhood, right, we start to develop this understanding that if I'm thinking of something, that doesn't automatically mean that other people know what I'm thinking. I have to share it with them, right? You'll see this a lot with little kids where what they might do is they might do something wrong. Maybe they break something or do something wrong, but they they're alone, so they don't even so typically, of course, what that would mean is that if they do this alone, no one else knows about it, right? But what they might do is they might immediately assume that they're in trouble, right? Because they just did something wrong. And they're going to go running to mom or dad and saying, don't be mad, I'm sorry, everything, because they assume that the parent already knows about this, right? They're having trouble distinguishing what they know versus what other people know versus don't know, right? And so the idea here is that once they start to acquire theory of mind, right, and understanding about how people's personal mental states are private, unless we choose to share that information, then that means they've acquired this so-called theory of mind or schema of mind, right? This, for example, goes along with the ability to lie, even, right? Because if I know something, but I tell you the opposite of what I know, so I'm deceiving you. This reveals the fact that I already know that you don't know this, and I'm going to try to manipulate your knowledge by telling you something that is not true, right? So that requires theory of mind, right? So this is part of the social pragmatics. So in fact, yes, lying is part of the social pragmatics of language because in this case, I already am making certain suppositions about what you know and what you don't know, and I'm going to try to manipulate your knowledge in some way. What's also relevant here is merely the fact of asking questions, right? Asking questions also supposes that you have information that I don't have, and I can just ask you to share that with me. It reveals that I'm capable of understanding what might be going on in another person's mind. So here I have a list, though, of 4 components of the pragmatic side of language. Presupposition, I used that word a couple of times already. So we presuppose a lot of things about other people when we interact with them, right? So even for saying something as mundane as, "Are you going to work again today?" In what situation might I say that, right? Let's say that I have a roommate and my roommate has a part-time job and they only work a few times a week. And so if I come out of my room, I wake up in the morning and I see my roommate and I say, "Are you going to work again today?" That presupposes lots of things, right? It presupposes, as I have on the slide, that this person has already been to work before, right? This again, right? But it even presupposes my entire knowledge about that person's job, right? That they work some days, but not necessarily every day. And today is going to be a day where they do or don't go to work, and I'm asking them this, right? So there's a lot of presuppositions about the work, and I don't have to say that out loud, right? It would be pretty weird for me to say something like, "I am aware that you have a part-time job that does not require you to go to work every single day. Is today one of the days where you would have to go to work?" Right? No one, I hope, talks like that. Um, so, and so we're able to simplify our questions quite a bit by just letting the presuppositions be presupposed and just asking in a much simpler way, "Are you going to work again today?" Right? That's it, right? Inferences. So the idea is someone can tell us something here, and they don't necessarily need to spell out every single thing that they're saying. We can just infer the parts that are left out. So if I say, "You have not done one single bit of work today," then I am implying that you should have been doing some work today, right? Right? Why else would I be asking or saying this, right? I'm also what's also maybe left unstated is that this might even be a command that you should get to work, right? So if I'm your boss at work and I say you've not done a single thing today, then what's left kind of for the listener to infer is that they should have been working and they better stop whatever clowning around they're doing and get back to work, right? So that's the idea here, right? Some of these inferences are logical inferences, right? So that means that I can simply just, given the nature of what's happening here, I could maybe deductively conclude something. So if again, if I'm this person's boss and they haven't done any work today, so then I say, uh, your laziness forces me to fire you. Well, I haven't said you're fired, right? But I have certainly left it very obvious that that's the case, right? So there's an inference that you can draw, and it's pretty logical, I think, at that point. Now, there are other situations where maybe it's not quite so logical, but it's at least reasonable to draw the inference. So if I said, as again quoted on the slide here, you're the worst employee ever, so I have assigned all of your duties to Bill, whoever Bill is, then if I'm saying basically I'm giving all of your job to this other person, you don't have a job to do anymore. So it's reasonable to conclude, speaking about talking about language here, that you're fired, right? So these are all parts of the social pragmatics of language. All right, now let's come back to this previous slide. Grammar, the grammatical rules. So rules for combining sounds and symbols. There's lots of rules here. So phonology, right? Phonology represents the phones, the sounds of language. And so there are some sounds that the human vocal tract can make, and there's really a lot of sounds, right? I don't know if there's ever been some complete list that's been fully decided on that counts as possible phones, but at least 40 different sounds. Most languages use some number much smaller than that for the possible sounds. Actually, no, it's more than that. I have to go back and look, but I think it's actually closer to 140 sounds. But most languages use somewhere around 30 to 40 sounds for their languages. So what that means is that when I'm speaking, there's going to be a limit on the kinds of sounds I'm going to make. And that's part of the phonology of language, right? So there are some languages, for example, that use pops and clicks and so forth that in English would not be part of a meaningful sound for language. Some languages use nasalization, some use tonality. And again, in English, those are not typically components that impact the meaning of a word. What's also relevant to phonology here are certain constraints on pronunciation, right? So, for example, there's some sounds that work well together and blend well together. For example, if I say the word lamp, I have my lamp here, right? So if I say the word lamp, I'm ending that in the sound amp, A-M-P, right? And so the M and the P kind of blend together to make that ump sound, right? What if I wanted to have a new word and I wanted to invent a new word and I wanted to call some other object that I have invented lamp? I can't even say it, right? I'm trying to put an N instead of an M before the P, so L-A-N-P. That's not quite something that we can pronounce, right? Because the M and the P in lamp blend together nicely, but the N and the P do not, right? So that represents a phonological constraint where we're basically going to say these sequences of sounds just simply can't go together. My mouth can't make that sequence sound right. And I have a little section on language production, speech production coming up, and we'll explore a little bit more details about what that looks like, but that's part of it. Morphology represents how we change words a little bit here. So simple rules for like adding an S to a noun to make it plural, that's a morphological rule. We have some irregular versions of that, right? There are times where instead of saying, a lamp becomes lamps, I might add the I sound, right? That's a holdover from some old Latin stuff, right? So octopus might become octopi or something like that. But the idea is we do at least have some rules, right? And these changes to the words are designed to carry an important, meaningful component to them, right? Also conjugating verbs to make a verb past tense and so on and so forth. There are rules for that. And again, we have regular and irregular verbs, but these are all part of the morphological system of our language. And then, given that we know the sounds and the words and the form of the words, we have to put them together into longer statements and sentences. And that's where we bring in the syntax, right? The word order. And there's a lot of flexibility here, but nevertheless, there's plenty of constraints about word order, right? And so one of the things you might notice is that this kind of series of constraints from the sounds to the words and the sequence of words in a sentence is sort of hierarchical. So I have a slide for that too. So this hierarchical patterning comes from here the idea of the players talked to the fans. I'm also mentioning communication and pragmatics here, and I'll explain why. But let's work at the hierarchy first. Let's go to the very bottom. We have the phonology. Don't have all of the phones mapped out here, but this use of like letters with the forward slashes on either side, that's usually an indicator to mean we're talking about the sounds here. So not the letters th, but the sound th, right front that goes with the th, and then the of the e at the end of that word. So then we put the together to make the, right? And so that becomes the word, and that's at the level of morphology. Then is the word the, right? Let's look at the word player, right? So we have the pa for the p, we have the la, and then we have the a vowel there. So play, and so that's our root, but we add the er suffix to mean person who plays, and then we add the s sound to the end of that to make it plural. So there's a kind of a hierarchical patterning there, right? We have the phonemes, the sounds that feed into the syllables, and then the syllables get sequenced based on things like roots and suffixes and affixes like the s, and then that becomes the whole word players. And then as we keep on going through to the second clause, right? So we have these clauses, the players, that's our subject, and then talk to the fans is the predicate of the sentence. And so again, we have talked being said as past tense there. So you have the root talk, and you have the ed suffix to the fans. Again, fans probably should be broken out there with the s there, but it's not. And then this all goes together to become the discourse, which is, again, my surface structure. I wanted to describe something to a person. I wanted to say the players talk to the fans because I observed maybe some players after the game interacting with the fans. So that's the idea that I want to communicate to someone else. And so I have to choose the appropriate surface structure to get the idea across. So it takes us back to the communication side of things here. Now, what I've kind of left somewhat implicit here is this idea of grammar putting constraints on my choice of surface structure. So this is something that we kind of need to talk about a little bit here. What is grammar, other than these rules that I've just described, right? The phonological rules, the morphological rules, the syntactic rules. So here's something weird. We know the language, we know the grammar of the language that we speak, right? If you're a fluent native speaker of English, then you know English grammar. But at the same time, if I were to ask you questions such as, what are the rules of your language? It might be very, very difficult for you to actually express those explicitly, right? And I want you to remember when we talked about memory systems and we talked about the difference between explicit and implicit memory here. Learning language and learning grammar apparently is one that's very implicit here. Why, for example, if you're a native speaker of English, then in 9th grade or 10th grade, if you take an English grammar class, why don't you just automatically get an A+ in that? I mean, you're already a native speaker of English, so what could possibly be hard about taking a grammar class or an English class, since you already know how to speak it? But of course, you don't necessarily automatically get an A+ in that class, and right, you got to work and study. So why would you ever get a C in a class about your own native language? Well, that's because there's a difference between the implicit knowledge we have about the grammar of the language we speak versus the more explicit stuff that gets covered in a class like that. And besides, it's worth pointing out that these kinds of classes that we call grammar classes are perhaps misnamed, and they might be better called style classes because they're really more focused on teaching you how to choose your surface structure in ways that are more effective. So that means if you are writing or if you are giving, say, a public speech, you want to frame your messages in ways that minimize ambiguity for the listener and maximize your effectiveness, right? And so that's all about surface structure choices, and that's the style side of things a little bit. Separate from that, though, is this idea called transformational grammar. So transformational grammar is a set of rules that convert the deep structure, that is, the ideas and thoughts that we have going on inside of us, into surface structure, the actual choices of words and phrases. What's really critical about this is that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about that sort of stuff, right? We just speak, right? All this time that I've been speaking, I didn't plan it too much, right? I'm just kind of speaking extemporaneously here, and that means that I'm on the fly. I'm looking at the slide and I'm thinking about what ideas that I want to get across, and I'm trying to find ways to express it as we go. And the actual grammatical rules that are converting the thoughts to my words, that's not something that I'm really actively choosing here, right? It's just built in to my brain structures that are relevant to language here, how to develop the language correctly, right, in ways that follow all of the rules. These rules are then considered to be implicit. So I think an example I gave when we talked about implicit learning was like riding a bike, where you just know that you have learned how to ride a bike, but you don't know anything about gyroscopes, and therefore you can't say anything necessarily about that knowledge. The same is true for grammar here. What we see with patterns of grammar acquisition in childhood is that kids develop their first words sometime around their first birthday. Then they have, this naming explosion, and they learn lots and lots of words between their first and second birthday, hundreds really. And then they start developing what's called telegraphic speech, putting these simplistic little 2 to 3 word sentences together until they start producing more complex grammatical constructions. And we can see then that they are acquiring the grammar of language. And pretty soon, by the time kids are 4 to 5 years of age, they are speaking fully, fluently in their language with lots of complex grammatical constructions in their speech. But again, they don't know what those grammatical rules are. They can't describe them, but it's an implicit skill here. So the whole goal of the field that we call psycholinguistics is to actually try to discover what are those transformational rules, right? How does that actually work in the human brain, that we are trying to, that we can generate language, but it appears to follow a bunch of implicit grammatical rules that we're not even consciously aware of. So that means there's some implicit knowledge in there. And the only thing that we can do as a psychologist is to study patterns of language to try to figure out what are those hidden rules of grammar, right? That's a big thing. We don't know the answer, right? So a big part of the study of linguistics is itself to attempt to understand the nature of grammar here. So in order for us to understand grammar, we need to have some criteria here. So we would say that if we develop a theory of grammar, it needs to have what is called observational adequacy, which means that if I generated a theory, I could then use that theory to make predictions about what are the acceptable sounds and sequences in the language. So it matches our observations of how people actually speak, right? It should also have descriptive adequacy. Here, what we're talking about is that we can say things that are different but still have the same meaning. And so one example of that is if I were to say something like, hey, close the door, And then I could also say something else. This is a kind of a colloquialism you may not have heard before. Depends on where you grew up, perhaps. But I could say, "Hey, were you born in a barn?" That's something my grandmother would have said to me when I was a kid if I come running into the house and I don't close the door behind me. So uh, it's another way of saying, "Hey, close the door." So we have two completely different statements here, but they have similar meanings here. So we need to, for a theory of grammar to work, it needs to be able to account for that kind of linguistic phenomenon, right? And then we also need to have what is called explanatory adequacy, which is uh, there are some aspects of grammar that we think are likely to be universal. This is appealed to quite a bit because children seem to learn language so easily. All they need to do is they just need to be given some exposure to language in their first few years of life. There's no explicit grammatical instruction or training happening. They just listen and participate, and eventually they just start speaking. And so the suggestion here is that there are language acquisition devices built into the brain, and that would suggest then that most of the grammatical rules are built into the brain, and that makes them innate. And if we make that claim, then that would also suggest then that these grammatical rules need to be universal to all languages, because there's no way for your brain to be kind of created as an English speaking brain versus a Spanish speaking brain versus a Mandarin speaking brain, because there's no way for your brain to know that before you're born, right? Before you're ever exposed to language. So that would mean then that the grammatical rules that are innate need to be pretty generic and universally true for all languages, so that no matter what language you happen to get exposed to, you're still going to learn it and you're going to develop grammatical fluency. And so that's the explanatory part here, is to explain these linguistic universals. As I said, we would talk about speech production. So let's talk about that. We also need to talk about speech perception, and that's going to come up in the next few slides. Production and perception are kind of two sides of a coin, maybe a little bit here. But let's do production, and then that's probably enough for this particular video here. So the brain regions involved in language, let's talk about that a little bit. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about brain regions other than maybe the hippocampus, maybe the prefrontal cortex when we talked about working memory and attention and so forth. But in the temporal lobe of the brain, we find auditory cortex. And so that's labeled in this diagram here in yellow, but just sitting a little posterior behind auditory cortex is a region called Wernicke's area, and that appears to be an important language comprehension center of the brain. So when it comes to the perceptual stuff, we need to think about the importance of Wernicke's area. But in the frontal lobe of the brain, we have the motor areas that are important for controlling movements, and that's kind of important for language because language does involve a lot of movements, right? Gestures of the vocal tract, and that all needs to be coordinated. And Brokaw's area sits adjacent to the primary motor areas, and that is now our what we understand to be the primary place where speech gets planned and organized. So importantly here, this may be where a lot of that transformational grammatical stuff is happening, right? That it shapes the structure of language as it is part of the language planning process. And then once that is planned and organized, it gets sent to the motor area that issues the commands to the speech articulators to start doing their thing, right? The lips, tongue, jaw, vocal cords all need to be moving and vibrating in coordination with each other here. So then that gives us the ability to talk about how the speech articulators themselves work to shape the sounds, because what's happening here is that when we are producing language, we are causing sound in our pharynx with vocal cord vibration. We pass air across the vocal cords and change their tension, and that causes a vibration that generates the sound. But what's also important here is that in order to change the sound, we need to change the shape of our vocal tract. And that causes changes in the way the sounds vibrate throughout the vocal tract, modifying the nature of the sounds that come out of our mouths, right? So when it comes to vowels, this is somewhat simple to explain a little bit, because you can simply just change the shape of your vocal tract and not do any movement, right? So ah, do that, right? Make a ah sound, and now make a e sound, right? And you're going to notice how you change the shape of your vocal tract versus ah, e, o, oo, right? And so you're changing the shape each time you make a different vowel sound. And it's kind of easy to feel that a little bit. Those vowels are also the very first things that babies are able to do when they start babbling. This is called cooing. Before they babble, really, is just they go ooh ah, right? So it's easy because you don't need to do a lot of extra stuff other than just vibrate your vocal cords and adopt some posture with your vocal tract. But then if we want to put consonants in there, what we have to do is we have to start interrupting the airflow. That's how we define consonants, as some sort of interruption of the airflow. And how we categorize them is based on where we interrupt the airflow. So we can have what are called bilabial consonants, and that means bilabial means two lips. So ba, pa, ma, those are all bilabial. And by the way, that explains my example before about how it's possible to say lamp because M is a bilabial consonant and the P is also a bilabial consonant. So when you're putting the ump together in lamp, your lips are already together, so the M and the P can be easily co-articulated. But the N, on the other hand, what is the N? So if you look in our diagram here, there's an arrow pointing to something called the alveolar ridge, and you can feel that with the tip of your tongue right behind the top of your front teeth here on the top. There's a little ridge on the roof of your mouth, and that's called the alveolar ridge. And so when you are producing the n sound, n, you should be putting the tip of your tongue right on the alveolar ridge. And so we'll call that an alveolar consonant. Also, d and ta. So that makes sense then that if I want to say the word candy, right, it's easy to blend the N and the D because they're both alveolar, but I cannot make a new word that involves an NP because then I have to go from the alveolar N to the bilabial P. And likewise, it's hard to put the M in front of the D, right? Because again, the bilabial M doesn't really match the alveolar D sound, right? So we have the alveolars, we have the bilabials, we also have the labiodentals, right? So that means teeth and lips, right? So va, fa, where you bring the teeth over your lip. We have the interdentals, where you put your tongue between your teeth for the th sound. We also have the velar consonants. The velum is the back of the mouth, so the g, ka, where you raise the tongue to the back of the mouth. And then we also have nasals, and that's really what M and N are, and ing. Those are all, we pass a little air through the nasal cavity here. We also wanted to discriminate consonants based on the type of airstream construction. So the examples I've been giving, a lot of them are stops. So a stop is when you actually stop the airflow. So the b sound, for example, it's bilabial, but technically it's called a bilabial stop because I'm stopping the airflow right behind the two lips, and then it kind of bursts out. Ba, right? Pa is as well. Ma is also bilabial, and a bilabial stop. The da and ta are alveolar stops. Ga and ka are velar stops. So one thing you might be asking here is, well, how are da and ta different from each other if they're both alveolar stops? This relates to the third feature here, voice onset time. Sometimes it's referred to as voicing, voice versus voiceless, but voice onset time is a better description, I think. So what happens is that when you make the da sound, you are pushing air through the mouth, and you interrupt the airflow by stopping it at the alveolar ridge with your tongue, da, right there. But you're also following that up with some vocal cord vibration because there's this vowel sound that follows the da, right? I'm saying right? It's try that again. It's right? If you can hear that, I'll get closer to the mic. And so that's annoying, I'm sure. Usually we don't have that long of a gap between the pronunciation of the alveolar stop and the onset time of that vowel that follows. But vowels are always voiced. So that's kind of the critical thing here. So whether I'm saying da or d or do or do, the timing of the vowel voicing after the alveolar stop is very, very brief, right? There's not a lot of pause there between the alveolar stop pronunciation and then the vowel voicing that immediately follows. But when I have a t sound, I'm delaying the onset of that vibration by just a brief fraction of the second, right? So the difference between da and ta is that the ta has a slight whispery component to it because I can delay the voicing for just a fraction of a second, right? And that's exactly what the difference is. And the same goes for the ba pa, right? They're both bilabial stops, ba pa ba pa, but the ba has a very short voice onset time, and the pa is more whispered, sometimes called voiceless, but it just has a longer voice onset time. And also, again, ga and ka also have the same distinction there. What about the ma, right? So if ba and pa are both bilabial stops and they differ in their voice onset time, how do we incorporate ma? Well, that's where the nasal side comes in, right? So if I let some air pass through my nasal cavity while saying the ba sound or pa, technically it's more of a pa sound. But if I'm going to say pa, but then in addition to the pa, I'm also putting air through the nasal cavity, then it becomes ma, right? And that's how I say ma, is just by modifying the pa to become nasalized. That's also exactly what happens with a na sound, is that I'm making a ta sound, but I'm putting air through the nasal cavity, and then it becomes na. And also, that's where the ing comes in, because instead of saying a ka, what I'm doing is I'm adding the nasal component, and ka becomes the ing sound. So in each one of these cases here, we take a stop at some different location in the vocal tract. Some, by the way, are not stops, but things like the interdentals and the labiodentals. I'm not really stopping the airflow. So when I say th by putting my tongue between my teeth, I'm not completely stopping the airflow, but I'm letting the air slip through that little small gap between my tongue and teeth. Or the same goes with the va and fa, where I'm letting the air kind of slide through between my teeth and lip. And these are called fricatives. And so we have that. There's also a sibilant, so that's the S. And the S is actually alveolar as well, but it's because I'm letting the air slide through more fluidly, then I get a very different sound than when it's a stop, like ta and da, right? So s, right? So these are all the different ways in which we manipulate the airstream, right? So we're going to move the vocal tract so that the airstream gets interrupted in different locations, control whether or not we let air pass through the nasal cavity or not. We either stop the airflow or restrict it in some way, so we get stops, fricatives, and sibilants, and so on. And then we also manipulate very, very subtly the timing of the voice onset time for the vowel that follows the consonant. And you put all of that together, and you can get all of the many sounds that we use, at least in the English language, in that way, right? There's a whole lot going on, right? And so speech production is complicated, but as you can see, there will be certain constraints that some sounds just don't really go together very well because well, they would just be clumsy for our articulators to put together in that sequence. But it also highlights what's kind of critically important about language, which is this idea of co-articulation, that when I'm producing sounds, I'm not just producing these phonemes one at a time, right? If I'm going to say the word cat, I'm not saying ka, right? Because if it was, then it really wouldn't matter what sequence of phonemes we put, right? Because I could say, like I said, with lamp, I could say la, p, right? And if I wanted to invent a new word that has a LANP spelling, then I could say la, n, p, okay? And that would be not too difficult to do. But because that's not how we actually speak, we don't just enunciate individual phonemes, we blend them together and co-articulate them so that all of the sounds kind of just blur together to create the sounds that we actually speak. I'm emphasizing this because as we transition over to speech perception, and I'm going to just introduce the problem here and then save our attempt at solving it for the next video, but it raises the question of how does the ear deal with this co-articulation business? Because what's happening is that it would be really easy if I were to say something like la, ma, pa, and try to send that to you as the word lamp, because all your ear would need to do is detect the four phonemes, the l, a, p, and and you could identify those four phonemes and recognize that that sequence of phonemes means a lamp, right? So you would have that down and say, okay, I know the word. But what happens is that when I am trying to describe this object and I put those four sounds together and I say it as lamp, then the idea is that your ear has to take the co-articulation of those sounds and kind of pull them apart and say, okay, I heard you say the word lamp, but what were the actual phonemes that are part of this word? And that means I kind of have to undo all of this blurring together of the sounds to decompose it back down into its phonemes so that I can recognize that, oh, you said this word, which means this thing, right? So back to that codifying and decodifying business again. So there's a big challenge here to answer this question, which is once our ear receives this acoustic pattern of, of phonemes that are all blurred together and blended together because of how we co-articulate, how does the ear deal with that and decode it and recognize the sounds and recognize the words? So here we got to get into speech perception and then later on, even what's called spoken word recognition. Let's save that for another video. So that will be today's video, and we'll catch you in the next one.